unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. We have come to the very end of our 7th season of Grand Tamasha. Over 20 episodes, we've covered a lot of ground, from the war in Ukraine to the UP elections and India's water crisis. We're taking a little bit of a break to recharge our batteries, but we'll be back in August to resume new episodes of the podcast. To send us on our way, I'm delighted to be joined by our Grand Tamasha News Roundup regulars, Sadanand Dhume of AEI and the Wall Street Journal. Sadanand, good to see you.
Good to be back.
And Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution, live from an undisclosed location somewhere in Europe. Tanvi, thanks for taking a break to join us.
Thanks, Milan. It's good to be in your part of the world.
So on today's show, we're going to cover 3 topics. First, we'll talk about the foreign policy crisis, which engulfed India last week after 2 BJP spokespersons made statements criticizing the Prophet Mohammed, leading to violent clashes in some Indian cities and a furious backlash from many of India's Muslim-majority partners. We'll discuss the implications of this crisis for Indian foreign policy. Our second topic will be the really 180-degree turn in popular perception, in my view, of India's stance on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We'll discuss why views on India's position have changed so significantly and whether this marks an important milestone for Indian diplomacy. And last but not least, we will ask Tanvi about her recent visit to Singapore, where she took part in the Shangri-La Dialogue. This year's conference was notable not just for the fact that it was finally being held in person again, but also because of the charged rhetoric that came out of it on China and Taiwan. Let's start, though, with the international backlash to comments uttered by 2 BJP spokespersons. Sadanand, let me start with you. Maybe before we get into the implications of the crisis, let's talk about what the crisis was. Could you remind us what the origins of this particular kerfuffle were over the Prophet Muhammad?
So, Milan, it started late last month on one of India's distinguished and high-minded television news channels. And there they were having a discussion about whether or not it's an obscure sort of thing, but I'll recap quickly. They were having a debate about whether or not shivling, which is had been found, which is a representation of Shiva that is worshipped by Hindus, had been found in a mosque, and one of the panelists said something that to the BJP spokesperson sounded disparaging. And the BJP spokesperson, Nupur Sharma, retaliated by talking about the Prophet Muhammad and how he married his last wife, Aisha, when she was still a child. Now, this is sort of part 1. And part 2 was another person in the BJP, from the Delhi unit of the BJP, then subsequently tweeted about this, where he strongly suggested or implied that the marriage of the Prophet Muhammad with Aisha made Muhammad, in this BJP person's views, a rapist. So needless to say, this is incendiary. And needless to say, it had an incendiary effect.
So you wrote about this in your column last week for the Wall Street Journal, and you sort of began that column by asking the following question, which is, could India's fraught domestic politics hinder the country's transformation into a leading global power? That has been Modi's aspiration, this government's aspiration from the beginning. And in short, I think your answer to this question seems to be yes, it can. Tell us why.
So it can, for the sort of, obvious reasons that, it's hard to walk this tightrope where, on the one hand, for reasons of domestic politics, the BJP often publicly attacks Indian Muslims, and in this case attacked symbols of the religion and figures in the religion who are revered by Muslims across the world. And obviously this is why we've had this huge backlash. But I'd say, even beyond that, the question really is that, India has to come to terms with the fact that it has almost 200 million Muslims. And there are genuine internal stability issues related to constantly keeping interfaith relations on the boil for domestic political purposes. And I think there's a sort of, longer discussion to be had, maybe sometime on Grand Tamasha, about where liberal India went wrong in managing the question of pluralism. But it does seem clear that 8 years in, that the BJP does not have a better answer, and by most accounts with which I would agree, it seems to have no answer at all to how to deal with this question.
Tanvi, let me kind of transition now to the foreign policy implications. As you know better than most, this prime minister has made outreach to the Arab and Muslim world, particularly the Gulf countries, a key pillar of his foreign policy strategy over the past 8 years. For people who haven't been following so closely, why exactly has he dedicated so much time and effort to building up these relationships in the Middle East? And how damaging do you think these recent statements were to his cause?
So just going to the first part of that question, in terms of why has the Modi government, and frankly, previous governments devoted time to the Middle East, and you're right, he in particular has invested considerably in the region as a whole, but particularly relations with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries and Israel. And the reasons have tended to be one, kind of the huge Indian diaspora there. Estimates range from kind of 7 to 8 million. And it's the diaspora itself, so, jobs for Indians, but also remittances that they send home, and it's a considerable amount. And then that redounds to Indian politics, Indian economy, because it's a contribution, but also, this diaspora is linked to the kind of political side of the dynamics as well. Then there's kind of the economic side that is important beyond remittances, which is oil and gas in particular. The Middle East, for the longest time, has been India's major source of oil and gas, and significant proportions, a majority of it that India imports comes from these countries. It is, in any case, significant at any time, but it's different, for example, when oil is between, around $40 a barrel, which is what it was when Modi first came to power, and that gave him leverage because India had buying power, to when it is $120 barrel of oil. Because then that leverage that you think you have as market power is not there as well. And maybe, these countries are less willing to cut you some slack. And then the kind of new space that you're really seeing, a couple of places where you've been seeing why this region is important, is one, it is now being seen as a source of capital. As these countries have been seeing, looking for alternative sources of revenue, they have been taking kind of the money they get from energy sources and looking for places to invest. And this is fitting very nicely with kind of Modi's and the Modi government's desire to attract investment. Finally, the kind of geopolitical reasons. India is kind of the Gulf, the Middle East is right next door. India has an interest in this. It is the farthest edge of the Indo-Pacific for India, an interest in kind of not Chinese influence, not growing in a vacuum, and being part of that story. But also these countries have influence, for example, with Pakistan, and they have been helpful to India with Pakistan in recent years. So I think those are the reasons, and I think that is why, how damaging will some of these kind of this whole incident be. I think it really depends on the regimes themselves and on recurrences. So regimes, because India is important for these countries in the Gulf too, as a market and for other reasons. And the question is, do they actually want to move on? Was this a reaction to what they were hearing from the street? And do they say that they're going to also object to further instances? And I think that will depend on whether we see this recur again and again. And it brings up a point that, this is not the first time we've seen domestic politics and polarization affect Indian foreign policy in spaces that Modi has invested heavily in. The relationship with Bangladesh is a good example. I think one of the lessons is that you can't say we're going to say something for a domestic audience in this day and age and that not go to international audiences as well. So you can't really silo audiences anymore. And that's something the Modi government will have to, and the BJP, which is not an opposition party anymore. It is a ruling party, as Mohan Bhagwat, in fact, of the head of the RSS said the other day, and needs to be thinking and behaving in that manner.
Sadanand, I mean, I guess I'm trying to reflect on kind of two seemingly contradictory things, right? I mean, what does it say that the BJP has not a single Muslim member of parliament any longer? is currently in office, but at the same time feels like it must be seen as very responsive to this bevy of Islamic countries across the Middle East. Like, is that a contradiction?
Well, I'm not sure if that's a contradiction by itself, right? I don't think that these countries are looking particularly closely at the composition of the Lok Sabha. I think that they would be. In fact, the other thing that's quite interesting is that in many of these countries, what seems to really strike a nerve is any kind of insult to the symbols of Islam or the holy figures in Islam. They don't seem to have paid that much attention to the treatment of Indian Muslims. Sort of that tells you a little bit about sort of their set of priorities. But separate from that, I think it says something quite profound and quite worrying about Indian democracy. I'll just give you some quick figures. In 1980. Muslims were about 11% of the Indian population and about 9% of the Lok Sabha. So more or less sort of, some kind of parity. By 2014, Muslims were more than 14% of the population, but less than 4% of the Lok Sabha. So what you've seen is that as the Muslim population has grown, what you're seeing is that Muslim representation has fallen. And Muslim representation is also very low, as you know, in the IAS, in the police, in the army, and so on. So what you have is a very large minority, which is being essentially locked out of positions of power. This is very unhealthy. And I think that in this direction, India is actually moving in the opposite direction of many other established democracies. Let me quickly end by just making a comparison with Britain, right? The Conservative Party, which is the party of Enoch Powell and Rivers of Blood, they have people like Preeti Patel and Sajid Javed and all these other figures who are not white. They are from Muslim backgrounds, Hindu backgrounds, all kinds of backgrounds. Whereas we have the BJP in a country with a 14% Muslim population that does not have a single member of parliament, either in the lower house or in the upper house from the Muslim community. And frankly, that is shameful.
Tanvi, do you want to come in on this?
Just an additional point about kind of the broader issue, which is it's not just it took, for example, to Milan's point, it also took like audiences abroad to get folks in India to take it seriously, and that is something to think about as well. That it was the Modi government seemed more responsive to that. And I just add that, this wasn't just the Middle East. It was countries in Southeast Asia as well, including Indonesia, with which India is trying to invest in heavily in a relationship. I switched on the TV in Singapore, and there was this was the lead story on several channels. And so it was getting a fair bit of attention there as well. And so not just a Middle East India issue, but kind of an India global issue, or at least an India-Asia one.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what's going on with India's policy on Russia-Ukraine. I was in Delhi several weeks ago, and I was struck, I have to say, by how quickly the narrative around India's Ukraine policy seems to have changed, right? I mean, it's almost like ancient history now. When India's ambivalent position, shall we say, on the Russian invasion was roundly criticized by a whole slew of senior officials from major Western democracies. Now, today, far from being criticized, India appears to be sort of actively, being courted by countries far and wide, right? There have been a range of visits, both in Delhi. Modi's gone overseas, of course. Tanvi, why the change, right? I mean, it seems like almost sort of schizophrenic that we've gone from one extreme to the other polar opposite.
I think, Milan, some of it was, that India's diplomatic position itself has evolved. So if you look at the initial statement, so the initial readout of the first Modi-Putin call, it actually did read like support for Russia, or at least close to the Russian position, talking about, this is being a Russia-NATO issue, talking about legitimate security concerns and those kind of things. But you saw India itself, get more and more concerned and be more, at least even if not criticizing Russia by name, criticizing its actions and criticizing the implications that it was having for the international order and principles therein. And so you did see kind of India, at least its diplomatic position evolve. You saw its strategic communications evolve, in part to explain what it is why India was doing what it was doing. And that's connected to the fact that I think to a lot of countries, that don't actually think about India's Russia position, it was a bit of a shock. And that was amplified by the fact that India was on the UN Security Council. And so, it was the votes before there was any explanation that really got attention. So I think there's been some change also in the diplomacy and the kind of being on the front foot and explaining this. And then reverse kind of, European countries in particular, trying to understand what it is that lies behind this, and some in the US as well. I think the other thing is, I think for the kind of European governments in particular, and the US, there's the complications, whether it's India's complications of trying to kind of decouple, so to speak, or disentangle itself, and how hard it is to actually do that from Russia. But they've partly noticed it because they are having some problems. I mean, even the Europeans, they've talked about kind of these oil embargoes, but natural gas is still something that they will import in huge amounts. So that, you can't make these changes overnight that they were saying to India, you should just give some of these relationships up. But I think the other thing is, perhaps expectations of India have changed. And the question that we don't know the answer to yet is, has there been a recalibration of expectations in a positive way, where it's actually good to not have overheated or very high expectations of India being aligned, and that it's very specifically aligned in terms of balancing China, not globally? Or will a recalibration of expectations also come with less rewards for India down the line? I mean, I personally think India, for example, in the US, will be kind of its reliability will be assessed not on its Russia choices as much as its China choices. But it really depends also on how India kind of handles this down the line. They will, I think, countries are cutting it, are being much more understanding. They also have real interest with India. And I think that is perhaps the major reason this change. That is, they've recognized that India is important to them strategically or economically. But India will have to be careful that it doesn't seem like it's taking advantage of the situation in terms of, for example, hopefully not importing things like wheat that Russia is essentially stealing from Ukraine, or areas that it's occupied in Ukraine. And, needing to be a bit careful about that, because I think that will not go to India's benefit. And second, not do what it accused Europe and the West writ large of doing, which is lecturing. So, it's one thing explaining. There's another thing kind of, being overly kind of assertive about India's position to the point that it will actually hurt India if it's seen as, lecturing others in terms of kind of their foreign policy in the way that India has accused them of doing.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Sadanand, let me ask you whether this is a victory for Indian diplomacy. I mean, some people have called India's aggressive response to its critics as quote unquote mini wolf warrior diplomacy. We know that the external affairs minister in particular has been unafraid to wield these kind of very quick one-liners to push back on anyone who criticizes India's position on the evasion, on oil imports, on Russian defense imports. Do you feel confident in saying that this sort of brash Indian diplomatic style is in fact paying dividends?
Well, I'd separate that, right? Those two things. I'm not a particular fan of wolf warrior diplomacy, either of the Chinese or the Indian variant. But I do think that this is a diplomatic victory for India, quite separate from that. The fact is that India has managed to make the US and the Europeans come around to its point of view. It has essentially explained that it is too important a relationship to sort of, to rupture over this issue. And in the end, other countries have come around, perhaps reluctantly, to India's view on this. And you don't see the kind of pressure or the kind of rhetoric that you saw early on during the Russian invasion. So in that sense, it's clearly a diplomatic victory. And I think that Jaishankar and the Modi government deserve credit. I'm not a particular fan of the sort of some of the style of communication. I recognize that, just as, Tanvi pointed out earlier, we live in an interconnected world where what you say on domestic television ends up being sort of seen all over the world. We also live in a world where so much of what you're saying to the world is in fact for domestic consumption. And I think some that some of the brashness and some of that sort of plays to the idea, particularly with the party base, that India has really arrived, which is another reason why, they were so shocked by the tame response to the outrage in the Gulf, because they sort of have this kind of, this fantasy idea that India under Modi is as powerful as Victorian Britain at its peak. So I'm not a fan of the style, but I will acknowledge that this is a diplomatic victory for India.
Tanvi, just to kind of round out a point that you made earlier, you have been following for many years energy policy in India quite closely. There have been many reports. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that India is dramatically ramping up its purchases of Russian crude at bargain prices. This is happening at a time when many in Europe are at least talking about, not necessarily always implementing, bans on Russian oil. I'm curious what you make of this. I saw some comments from the U.S. Special Envoy for Energy Security, Amos Hochstein, who in an interview said, I basically been advising my Indian colleagues two things. One is don't make it seem as if you're kind of exploiting the situation. And second is make sure you bargain well, because there are not a lot of buyers for Russian oil right now. Can you tell us sort of the facts? How much is India importing? How significantly have those numbers risen? And is this going to create another headache now for Indian diplomats who are going to have to go resolve?
So just in terms of kind of the numbers, Reuters estimated that India is in May, the latest month for which we have complete numbers, India imported about 16.5% of its total imports from Russia. This made Russia the second largest source of oil imports for India after Iraq. This is kind of considerably up from what it imported kind of the previous month, but also kind of in all of last year. And so I think you are going to see, if this continues, this be a kind of a bumper year for Indian oil imports from Russia, which is traditionally not a big source. So, when Foreign Minister Jaishankar said that India only imports kind of 1 to 2% of oil, that has been the case. Now, partly because he has made that kind of set that metric, it does seem, that his line was, I think, something like, India imports as much oil all year or something like that as or maybe in a month that Europe does in an afternoon, both because India is importing a lot more than it did before, but also that Europe might perhaps be importing less down the line. Nonetheless, they will probably be paying Russia more energy revenue writ large because of their gas purchases as well. India also imports coal from Russia. Oil has not been a traditional kind of product that India imports from Russia because it is a freight costs and things like that. So one question is going to be how long does this continue in terms of these bumper numbers of Indian oil imports from Russia? I think to some extent it'll depend on if there are these kind of new sanctions that have been talked about on shipping, on insurance, will go into effect, and does that make it harder for Indian importers to import that? It doesn't make commercial sense anymore because it adds to the cost. At the moment, the reason India is importing is that these heavy discounts that the Russian producers are giving. I think the other thing it depends on is, do the countries in the Middle East, which have essentially put an Asian premium on oil and are charging kind of countries like India a lot more, do they kind of reconsider? Does a slowdown in the economy actually reduce oil demand? And does that bring prices down? And that's not good for other reasons, but nonetheless, that. And India, the other thing is India is also importing record levels of oil from African countries. And does that go up? So does India basically have other options? We'll see. Some of this is for local demand, and that's the case that the Indian government makes. But a considerable amount of this now seems to be for Indian kind of refiners who are using it to have bumper kind of exports. And that is where it gets a little bit complicated. So I don't know if it's necessarily the amounts. I think some of that will depend on what the Biden administration is saying is, does India look like it's exploiting the situation? Some of it will depend on things like, does it get more complicated where countries in the West that buy these petroleum products from Indian refiners, do they start to say, we will not buy, and I don't even know if you can track these things, we will not buy these products. And then, you actually have some energy companies who say, look, if people don't buy the Russian oil that is in the market, you are going to see these high prices. And so, it should be bought, or there should be some way of kind of thinking about that issue that is different from the current situation. But, in the course of, given Russia's invasion to Ukraine, this is kind of a sensitive issue for people, given that this will be filling Russia's coffers, which then will actually fund its war effort. So complicated issues around this issue, but around this issue as a whole. But I think some of the concern about India on this has already been there for a while. But I think it will depend really on what happens in the months ahead. And also, does Russia look like it's taking advantage of the situation, or does it escalate in ways that make India's stance a little bit more concern-worthy for its other partners?
Just want to kind of end the main part of this episode by talking a little bit about the conference you just attended, Tanvi, in Singapore, the Shangri-La Dialogue. This is, I think, widely thought of as Asia's sort of premier defense and security summit. The last two editions were canceled due to COVID, so this is the first time, I believe, an in-person conference has taken place since 2019. Obviously, Sadanand and I were not there, so maybe I would ask him to join me in throwing some darts your way. Let me start by asking about the Quad. The past few months, I think, have been very good to the Quad. There's a sense that the U.S., Australia, India, Japan have turned a corner in terms of working through whatever sources of mistrust there were that once plagued this collective. How much of this sort of Quad bonhomie was on display in Singapore in the room?
So it was interesting. I mean, one thing that became clear is that Quad has become a fixture in people's minds and in rhetoric. It's talked about a considerable amount. Also, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, who gave the keynote speech, mentioned it and mentioned relations with kind of the three Quad partners as well. If I recall correctly, it was interesting. The new Australian Defence Minister didn't mention the Quad per se, but he did mention deepening ties with India and Japan considerably, as well as with kind of the U.S. of course, in that alliance. So it did come up in conversations at the kind of at the Shangri-La Dialogue, but also in other meetings I had in Singapore. One of the things I was actually trying to ask is how people in the region, particularly Southeast Asian countries, there was some representation from the Pacific Island states, how they saw the Quad. And one thing I think that really has helped is reframing it as this kind of force for public good, as solutions provider, and the kind of providing vaccines and those kind of things. But I think people are looking for implementation. There were more mixed views on this idea of Quad taking on a little bit more of a security role. And I think there's more comfort with that happening quietly if it does, but also kind of not necessarily as the Quad per se, but the Quad countries being more active within the bilaterals and trilaterals. And then I think, finally, it's the question is, there was some interest in this maritime domain awareness partnership for the Indo-Pacific that the Quad announced in the recent Leader Summit, but a lot more kind of questions on it. So I think, it would be helpful. I will say perhaps the Quad would have got more attention had the Indian Defense Minister been there. He wasn't. The head of India's Eastern Naval Command was there. There was others from the Indian government. But I hope at the next Shangri-La, the Indian Defense Minister is there, because I think it offers a platform for India to kind of express its view, talk about what it's been doing in the region, and it has been a considerable. The good news was that Rajnath Singh, the Indian defense minister, was in Vietnam, providing patrol boats, signing Vietnam's first logistics support agreement. The Indian foreign minister will be hosting a foreign ministerial with the ASEAN. With the ASEAN foreign ministers. So it's not that India is not engaging in this region, but this would have been a good opportunity to actually highlight what India is doing in the region, both by alone with these countries, with ASEAN, but with the Quad countries as well. So I think there could have been more, but it is clear that the Quad, at least for now, has become a fixture, not just substantively, but in kind of countries' rhetoric as well.
Sadanand, I'm curious, do you have anything you want to ask Tanvi while we're on this topic?
Yeah, so I'm sort of curious. I mean, coming back to our earlier discussion about Russia and Ukraine, what was your sense of the room? Was the general sense you got, particularly from Asian participants, was it closer to the Indian view, which is sort of, if I had to summarize crudely, is that the Ukraine problem is more of a European problem and don't necessarily expect us to get directly involved, or was it kind of closer to the Western view, which is that this is the number one crisis in the world, and we must all be focused on it?
I think and I think it was an adjust. I mean, even the Indian view, I think, has been to the Europeans that look, you can't. It's not that this is not everybody's problem, and I think there was a lot of discussion of the implications of this for food and energy security, and I think food security in particular is becoming an issue. The kind of impact potentially in the next few months on the global economy was another subject of discussion. So I think it was kind of similar to the from several countries, similar to at least the Indian views that Europe, which is looking at this as this is the crisis for everybody, but they don't show that similar understanding of when there are crises that smaller countries in Asia are facing, or countries in general in Asia are facing. I think the other thing, and it's worth people listening to the Singaporean defense minister's speech on this, is about framing, which is not framing this as and in general. And I think this was a kind of a 2-point message: one about Russia, Ukraine, but one about also how the U.S. is approaching the Indo-Pacific, which is don't frame this as democracy versus authoritarianism, that there won't be too many buyers for that, and that you actually frame it on principles, that it's principles that have been violated, and those principles are important to countries in Asia too, and that would be much more effective. And you saw that even a little bit. I think President Zelensky gave kind of a virtual speech, and he seemed to focus his remarks much more on kind of the violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty. That is something most countries, Asian countries, can identify with.
Tanvi, just a really quick final question on this, which is I want to ask you about the mood on China. I mean, the Chinese defense minister gave what was reported to be a sort of rather aggressive speech, accusing the United States of being a bully, hijacking countries around the region. I think that was his word. He said his country would, quote, fight to the very end, end quote, to stop Taiwanese independence. So when it comes to sort of China's role in the broader Asia Pacific, did anything stand out for you?
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, one, the session, it was clear the questions that the Chinese defense minister got this time around were tougher, or at least not as, cooperative or talking about kind of issues in general as they were in 2019. And in 2022, he got questions along the lines, and this wasn't just from kind of folks who are looking at this from the Western point of view. It was from, countries in Asia essentially saying, you gave a speech that was all about, it almost seemed like geopolitical gaslighting to me, at least, but even clearly to others in the room, where this was a speech about how, China wanted regional peace and stability, wanted respect for basic norms, wanted things like mutual respect. And almost every country in its neighborhood has faced assertiveness from China and a violation of norms, if not law. And so it seemed a lot of the questions were along the lines of, you just said you support all these principles, and yet your actions have not shown this, including in terms of things like military buildups, violations of these principles. So that was striking. Having said that, one thing I'm always struck by in when you talk about Southeast Asia, where this was, and ASEAN is always represented by its member states, you do see kind of this diversity across ASEAN, but also diversity within countries about views on China. But you also see what, in my mind, sometimes is a little bit of false equivalency between the US and China, saying, both sides are creating these problems, or, but then sometimes it goes to the point of criticizing US for what are talked about as destabilizing moves, but then not kind of criticizing China, for example, with when PLA planes have been harassing, Australian and Canadian Air Force jets in the neighborhood, which could lead to if not accidents, a crisis. This is not something you hear countries in the region speak out about or criticize. And so, it's understandable to some extent. China is their neighbor. They have to deal with it. But it is also interesting to me how they do hold China and the US perhaps to different standards.
So just to wrap up, to send our listeners off into the summer, I thought we could end the show by asking both of you guys, and I'll volunteer too, is there a sort of summer recommendation you have, a Twitter follow, a newsletter, a resource on India, something you'd like to plug for people who are trying to nerd out in the dog days of summer? Sadanand, let me start with you. Is there anything you'd like to put forward?
I was very, very strongly tempted here in Milan to put forward something not very seriously, mostly in order to troll Tanvi. But with an act of supreme willpower, I'm going to resist that.
I mean, because Tanvi has such a shortage of trolls online, you needed to add.
She could always do with another. But I have, in a supreme act of willpower, I have resisted that temptation, and I will instead offer a serious recommendation. I think Shoaib Daniel at Scroll has a wonderful newsletter. I read it regularly. It gives you an unusual angle. I think he curates things in an interesting way. So I would definitely recommend that.
We will link to that too. I agree. I love this newsletter. It's called the India Fix, and it's required reading for me every week. Tanvi, what about you?
So this week is the 2-year anniversary, if one should use that word, of the Galwan clash between India and China. That's been a real inflection point in the relationship. One thing it has done is it has generated a real interest in kind of India-China relations, both in India and abroad. And there are a few newsletters that have come up in these kind of couple of years that actually focus on looking at how India sees China or issues of interest to India. One and the three I follow are Anant Krishnan's newsletter on this, the Takshashila one that is put together by a team, Takshashila Institution one, and then Suyash Desai's newsletter. There's obviously some overlaps you can pick and choose, but I follow all three, and I think they're really worthwhile to subscribe to.
So I am going to make a plug also for a newsletter. I'm going to keep it all in the house, as it were. There is a relatively new newsletter that's being put out by my Carnegie India colleagues, Suyash Rai and Anirudh Burman, called Ideas and Institutions. And Anirudh and Suyash kind of lead our political economy work out of our Delhi center. And this is a fortnightly newsletter. It's very smart. It's very thoughtful. It's usually divided into two parts. The first part is a sort of deep dive into a kind of thorny policy issue where Suyash and or Anirudh kind of, try to make this somewhat accessible by kind of going deep on a subject. And then the second is usually a review of some kind of a book or an essay or something that's worth reading. And there have been, I think, 7 iterations thus far, and they have been without exception, really interesting. And so you can find that on the Carnegie India website. You can follow both of those guys, Anirudh Burman, Suyash Rai, on Twitter. But highly recommend it, and glad that they've decided to do it. Tanvi, Sadanand, thank you so much for coming on the show. You guys have rounded out our season 7. Hope you both have wonderful summers, and we'll be back in the fall when we get started again.
Look forward to it.
Hope your listeners have a great summer.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff J. Pranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.